Good afternoon. I'm Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. And first, let me thank all of our attendees for your support of NDIA and the Emerging Technologies Institute, and especially thank you for joining us for today's webinar entitled Cloud 101, presented by Matthew Butkovic. This webinar is part of our Tech 101 series. We try to distill complex technologies into an introductory webinar format with a focus on their national security impacts and implications. So we've all heard a little bit about how cloud computing is changing the way that the commercial sector provides services to consumers on a daily basis. It's probably being used by all of us in our daily lives, whether we know it or not. Matt is here to give us some of the basics of this important technology and to try to help us understand its implications for national defense. Let me start off with a few administrative remarks before we get started. To begin with, all attendee lines are muted, but if you do have questions during the webinar, and we hope you will, you can submit those questions in the question box in the webinar panel that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. We will do our best to get through all the questions during the question and answer period. No guarantees, but we will make our best effort. Another note, we are recording today's webinar for members who are unable to attend. Also, if you've listened to the webinar and you're interested in reviewing some part of it, please feel free to do that off the recording at a later date. And that recording will be posted, including not only the recording, but the slides and answers to the question and answer to our NDIA Connect website for your review within the next few days. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Matthew Butkovic. Matt is the Technical Director of the Cyber Risk and Resilience Assurance Directorate in the CERT division of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, that's CMU-SEI. One of the nation's leaders in the development of software, working hand in hand with the Department of Defense. Matt performs critical infrastructure protection research. He develops methods, tools, and techniques for evaluating capabilities and also for managing risk. He teaches graduate level cybersecurity policy courses, also teaches courses on organizational resilience and supply chain risk management at the Carnegie Mellon Heinz College of Information Sciences and Public Policy. Matt has more than 20 years of managerial and technical experience in information technology, and that particularly pertains to information system security, process design, and auditing, applied in the banking and manufacturing sectors. So without further ado, Matt, thank you so much for talking to us today on this very, very important subject, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to NDIA for the opportunity to present today. This being an introductory presentation, it's free of technical jargon, I believe, as much as possible. I'd like to keep the session as interactive as we can. I'm happy to take kind of any question. This is an expansive topic, and after today, I hope we've imparted the fundamentals that allow to have a deeper dive on the elements of cloud and cloud computing that might be most relevant for you. So let's just start with what is the cloud, right? And I've selected for our initial definition what's offered by NIST. So NIST, in this special publication 800-145, gives us attributes. In this collection of attributes comprise the cloud, or the set of concepts that, my apologies for that, that we would ascribe to a cloud environment. So I'll walk through these quickly here, and then we'll deep dive on a few of them. So, what are those characteristics? We see it starts with self-service, and then a reference to access, the idea of shared resources, elasticity, and then a measured service. So let's unpack that just a little. So what does the cloud offer you? What are the reasons to use the cloud? And I hope today I give a fairly balanced set of pros and cons regarding cloud computing. But let me offer this disclaimer. We're all going to use the cloud at some point. Now, the question is, how do we use the cloud in a risk-informed way? And how do we ensure that we optimize our investment in that cloud service or services? So the first benefit on the NIST list and on my list is flexibility. The idea here being that the cloud allows you to on-demand self-service. Therefore, if you need to provision compute power, provision storage, you can do this without a lot of hassle and in a self-directed way. The next attribute, right, is ubiquitous access. Access the cloud, right, anywhere, right, that the provider is offering to you the ability to access the services in a way that's persistent and convenient. Shared resources is third on the list, but in some sense, I think this is one of the key attributes of the entire concept, which is we are going to find efficiencies of scale. We're going to find gains in reliability and possibly security by having a shared pool of resources, that there's a fungibility to the resources. So if client A is using a slice of client B, and then they flip-flop the load, we aren't finding resource contention, and we're maximizing our investment in that infrastructure. Ability to scale. If you need to go from 0 to a petabyte of information, right, the cloud could be for you, but we'll talk about why there's a potential limitation there as well. But undoubtedly, one of the chief virtues and chief benefits of using the cloud is the ability to rapidly provision extensive sets of resources that are probably beyond the reach of most organizations doing it themselves. Well, but that comes with a specific price of admission. Now, I've described it here as pay by the drink. So that's you only pay for what you use. So I've been with Carnegie Mellon now for 13 years. When I was leaving private industry, the cloud was kind of coming to its own. And the chief sell that I saw was, well, you know, we're operating data centers, and those are really expensive. And we have a lot of staff to support those data centers. And we're constantly running into capacity issues, and we're not really sure what's coming down the pike for us in some of our regional data centers. So our business model is outpacing our IT infrastructure model in a sense. And the cloud, rightfully so, was seen as a way to fix that. That is, we'll have access to things when we need them, as we need them, and then when we don't need them, we can stop using. So maybe stating the obvious, but something that allows you to do is to avoid capital expenditure. Right? You can make this an OpEx-centric exercise. And of course, this is very attractive for many organizations. Now, the corollary being then, right, if you're avoiding capital expenditure, you're also then avoiding depreciation. And right, depending on your organization's specific strategy and your appetite for balancing OpEx and CapEx, this can either be a good thing or a bad. The cloud also offers the potential for improved security. It is absolutely true that the cloud service providers, and sorry, I'm playing a little fast and loose with terminology. I keep saying cloud service providers, and I'll unpack in a few slides the different models you may find in the cloud. But when I say this in kind of a generalized way, I mean public cloud service providers. Right? Certainly, they may do security better than you do currently. But there's no guarantee, and we'll talk about ways to kind of verify that. Again, in my mind, we have to be smart consumers of cloud services. And then one of the chief sells is improved reliability, right? If you don't need to worry about things like physical disaster or a wave of destructive malware affecting your infrastructure, that's probably a good thing if your core business isn't in that domain. So the cloud service provider then will assume those responsibilities for you in large part. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But the idea is it's obviating the need to do things that are often complicated, expensive, and difficult to predict. So what are the challenges? If you think about the benefits as being then offset by the challenges, well, on the list, I don't know that I'd call this a prioritized list, but it's sort of what came to mind for me. The first is managing identity and access management. So if you have an infrastructure now that extends beyond your own organization, and we'll talk a little later about the hybrid cloud, and you're now needing to do account management, authentication, authorization, credentialing across multiple environments, that can be a challenge for some. Not insurmountable, and I'll speak to ways in which tools can really help with that. Next on the list, I think, is a really important but sometimes overlooked component of this, which is variable cost. So we've described pay by the drink, right? Well, what you find, and I certainly saw this as I was transitioning out of industry, was we have this arrangement with a cloud service provider, and it's so easy and convenient to provision stuff, it sort of gets out of hand. So it has the potential to create headaches when you're doing financial planning. How much will storage cost us next month? Well, it depends, because let's say we have this new project, and this new project is going to use vastly more storage than we anticipate. Now, in the old way of working, the storage you had in your data center was the storage you had in your data center, right? And if you needed to add storage, you then anticipate that cost, you'd bring that storage online, and then we all had a mutual understanding of the cost. In this way of working, if you're not careful, a specific business unit or project or user can spin up these resources and then start creating the set of expenses that maybe you're not fully anticipating. Vendor lock-in. There's potential that the effort required to transition away from a cloud supplier or cloud service provider is so onerous that you'll just simply stay with that service, even if it's not meeting your needs. This is, again, one of those problems that I think early on in cloud computing, we knew the potential was there, but thought that this could be largely mitigated by standardizing the way we looked at data, standardizing the way that we looked at measuring performance, and saying, right, if something goes wrong, if it's not meeting our needs, we'll rapidly transition to another cloud service provider. But in reality, it's actually quite difficult to do that. I'd also say that there's a set of things you have to do as an organization pre-cloud that will kind of determine your fate in the cloud. If, for instance, you really don't know where your data lives and you can't classify it, that's a problem. And certainly, well, then, if you take those bad behaviors, or maybe that's sub-optimized behaviors, to the cloud, it digs a deeper hole for vendor lock-in. Managing at a distance or managing at arm's length is a difficult transition for some organizations, perhaps most organizations. So going from the days of having your own dedicated infrastructure and personnel dedicated to it, or perhaps it was an outsourcer that you used, but it was sort of within your control, to going to something that's more opaque is quite a challenge for some. And the coin of the realm changes. So instead of having sort of direct line access to the leadership in IT, you're now needing to engage in vendor management. And service level agreements become the way that you're going to not only determine performance, but also apply corrective action. So, there's sort of a slogan that if it's not in the contract, it's not real, right? Well, nowhere does that apply more than in the cloud. I'd also add that there's also, in some cases, there's a perceived and perhaps an actual loss of situational awareness, meaning that if your organization really places a premium on knowing the disposition of assets and understanding at a fine-grained level what's going on at any time with the digital assets of the lifeblood of your business, you may find it a bit disorienting at first, that you don't have a comparable level of understanding. An example being, where is our data? Well, if when I was in industry, we had data centers in 3 or 4 places around the world, and it was largely regionalized. In the cloud, you'll find answering the question, where is our data, might be more challenging. And you might find the sort of opaque nature to that transaction, which was the way that you get to redundancy, resilience, and availability is that we're spreading this data across multiple international data centers. And then last on this list is multi-cloud management. I kind of alluded to this earlier, which is you may find that a single provider is exactly the fit for you. You may find that an arrangement that has you managing some of your own private cloud and using a public cloud provider is the optimal mix. Well, think about managing multiple clouds and multiple cloud providers. It does sort of then ratchet up the level of attention and detail you have to examine. Carrie says, how do you handle classified information in the cloud? Is there any more of a security problem than traditional systems? So, Carrie, there's a couple of ways to answer that. The way you handle classified information in the cloud should be viewed as an extension of the way that you handle classified information. So there are certain cloud providers that offer a level of information protection. Think of the Gov Cloud that allow you to place classified information into those enclaves of those containers. So I think if I had to boil that down, it's a very good question. I would say that think of it as an extension, and you have to have verifiable trust in the enclaves in which you're placing that information. Is there any more of a security problem than with traditional systems? Now, that's a really interesting question. The answer largely is it depends. So we'll talk a little later about security in the cloud and security issues in the cloud. Does the cloud vendor do a better job of securing information than you did? Well, the answer may be they do, and therefore there's actually less to worry about. Or perhaps you're world-class, super diligent, and verifying your security in a way that's very unique. Well, then in that case, you may find the cloud vendor way of working a bit unsatisfying. So I hope, Carrie, I've answered the question for you. And thank you for the question. So moving on, I just wanted to give a little history of the cloud, because I think this is really interesting. I'm a big believer that past is prologue. So when you think about the cloud, it wasn't created from scratch out of whole cloth, right? This is in many ways, it's a return to early foundational concepts of computing, like shared resources, ubiquitous access, in a way that we sort of drifted away from when we moved to a client-server centric architecture in the 90s. So there's a few names on here. I kind of won't belabor this, but suffice to say that some luminaries at MIT and ARPA really gave us the foundational concepts that have become the modern cloud. And speaking of the modern cloud, we point to Salesforce.com, which stood up in 1999 as the first sort of modern practical cloud. And let me go to the questions here. Does decentralization offer a solution to some of the security resilience concerns? Joe, yes, it can, in the sense, and I would maybe parse security and resilience, but it can. So, dilution is the solution in a sense, right? So if you have multiple things that an adversary has to attack, it creates additional complexity for them. The flip side of that is you may be increasing the attack surface and complexity for yourself. So I would argue that doing that smartly and not centralizing your risk is a good idea, but you can also kind of get lost in that and then have pockets and islands where it's difficult to secure things because you're just doing too much at once. So I do think that for folks that are familiar with mainframes and kind of the early days of computing, much of the cloud is going to look very familiar to you in the sense that we understood early on that replicating some of these things again and again probably didn't make a lot of sense. So more contemporary history of the cloud. In 2006, we have Amazon offering their elastic compute service. And that was really kind of a watershed moment. In 2008, the Google App Engine, Microsoft Azure really hits a stride in 2010, and then Rackspace in 2010 as well. IBM with a smart cloud, and then the Google Compute Engine in 2012. So that was a very quick summary from the, let's call them the high spots in the contemporary history of cloud computing. I included the photo at lower right here because I think it's actually quite visually appealing photo, right? This is actually a data center in Montreal in the 1960s. And I think it, to me, represents what we think third-party relationships should be, right? You can walk up at any time and look in there and see the mainframes whirling away, and you could rap on the glass and wave to the operator. Well, in truth, that's not what IT ever was when you managed it, but it was closer. And what the cloud is more akin to a black box, right? And again, that's not a reason not to use cloud services, but it should be a reminder that the nature of our engagement with these resources and with the resources that manage the resources changes when you put that responsibility in the hands of a third party. When we think about the cloud, right, again, as a 101 or a primer on the cloud, there's two fundamental concepts I think we all have to master to fully understand the cloud. The first is the idea of a service delivery model. And here I've given you three versions, right? This is software as a service on the right, platform as a service in the middle, and then infrastructure as a service on the far left. And notice, right, you've got callouts for provider managed and then customer or client or organization managed. And this is really the key question, which is how much of the stack do you want to retain and own and manage directly? So in the case of software as a service, you're going to be presented a way to log into that software. Could be on in a browser, most likely in a browser. And you use those resources without any additional obligation to manage the infrastructure. Now, you can extend that concept then to platform as a service. So now the applications are yours, so that they're still being managed by your organization, but the provider's managing the rest of that stack. An infrastructure as a service is kind of another interesting hybrid where, I don't want to be in the business of the core network and storage considerations. I certainly don't want a data center, but I do want fine-grained control for application security and our database infrastructure. So again, this is, I think, one of those foundational concepts to keep in mind as we progress through the presentation. And there's a question in chat. We are looking at cloud through a sustainability lens. Is there a case for cloud as sustainable, lower carbon footprint alternative? Kevin, that's a really interesting question. I think there is. So if you think about centralizing this power-hungry equipment in a way that optimizes cooling and energy consumption, and then focusing on providers that are using the most sustainable forms of energy, then yes, I think, Kevin, you could look at the cloud with a sustainability lens or as a potential enhancement to sustainability. And someone says on slide 7, I'm wondering if that means the slides didn't advance. Is everyone, maybe if someone could say in the chat, are you seeing slide 8 at this point? Okay. Well, I'm going to continue on. If the slide's not matching the talk track, just let me know and I'll try to sort that out. But I'm seeing slide 7, slide 8. Okay, now on 8. Wonderful. Okay, so let's give it a little bit of lag time. I will back up just a minute. Okay, so we're going to transition now from discussing what we describe as service delivery models to the deployment type. So as I mentioned, right, I was being a bit reductive in describing the cloud when I was saying cloud service provider. Well, the truth is there's a few different types of clouds or flavors of clouds. The pure public cloud here on the left, that is where you pay a fee and you access a service and it's all in the hands of a third party. And you have a choice of the prior division of responsibility, right? So you can be fully software as a service through infrastructure as a service, but the cloud service provider owns the assets that you've elected not to manage yourself. Okay, so that's one version. The private cloud is emulating or replicating the flexibility, the scalability, the ubiquitous access of the public cloud for yourself. So maybe stating the obvious, this is a difficult proposition for many organizations. It could be expensive and certainly complicated. And I apologize, a train's going to pass by in a minute. I'm on Carnegie Mellon's campus. It reminds us that we were founded by an industrialist every time the train goes by. So I apologize if you hear a little noise in the background. In fact, I'm going to pause for just a few seconds so I don't have to compete with the train. Okay, so moving from left to right, let's talk about the hybrid cloud. So you can depend fully on someone else. You can own your own cloud, and then there's a middle position where you can own some of the cloud, and then someone else owns some of the cloud, right? And that's a hybrid cloud. And then at the far right, you have the multi-cloud, right? Which is you can have combinations of public, private, and hybrid across a larger estate. So let's say instead of having a single cloud service provider, a public cloud service provider, and your own cloud, you may have, let's say, 2 public service providers and 2 instances of your own cloud, and then, right, some combination of hybrid cloud. The point of these slides is, one, just to introduce the base concepts, but also to point out that there isn't kind of one version of the cloud, right? Again, we bias in our thinking to think public cloud because that's kind of the most common. But in truth, there are many ways and many combinations possible in cloud computing. How would software service work with the RFP process? For instance, how would one validate that a VM is STIG compliant when you don't compete we don't complete the OS stick. Right. So Ronald, I'd like to hold your thought just for a minute on that one. We'll table that. We'll talk about software as a service and just cloud services and attestation, evaluation control environment, just a couple slides, but that's a really good question. So let's talk just for a minute about the current landscape of cloud providers. In this case, I'm referring to public cloud providers. I've drawn a line here, and I think this is sort of the typical breakdown that you'll see, that Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, the Azure Cloud, and the Google Cloud are seen as like the big three, right? So if you total that up, you can see that's the majority of the market share. Below that line, then we have Alibaba Cloud, the IBM Cloud, Salesforce, and Tencent Cloud. So Tencent Cloud may be unfamiliar to you. Alibaba Cloud, you may know Alibaba from its e-commerce presence, but these are Chinese-based cloud providers. At right, this is Gartner's view of the Magic Quadrant, if folks are familiar with that depiction. So it's placing Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft, and IBM in the leaders count. But notice that in challengers, right, the Tencent Cloud, which we've just mentioned, and also Alibaba. And then there's a host of smaller players that I thought for this presentation probably really aren't that relevant. But yes, there is kind of a world of other smaller cloud providers. In our context, probably not as important as understanding in a detailed way what the top of the pyramid is doing. We have a question. What does cloud security look like against advanced persistent threat versus regular cyber attacks? Yeah, so I think the best answer I can provide is that the cloud security and non-cloud security exhibits the same behavior when faced with an advanced persistent threat. It comes down to the quality and depth of your capabilities, right? Your ability to identify, triage, respond, and recover. So I can't say categorically it's better or worse. It really depends on the advanced persistent threat. And in a few slides, I'll talk about an advanced persistent threat that actually did a great deal of damage in a public cloud environment. So I know it's kind of maybe an unsatisfying it depends answer, but truthfully, that's the best answer, which is it's not a monolithic something, right? The cloud is not singular in capability. It's going to vary by provider, by instance, and then we'll talk in a few slides about the things you need to do, right? Often organizations are surprised that even when you go to the cloud, the things you're asked to decide may look different and may be larger in number than you anticipated. But thank you, that was a good question. I touched on this already, but I think it's important, especially given the nature of our discussion today and the concerns that we have in the defense community, that the cloud is a global proposition. How do you optimize your investment as a cloud provider? Well, you deliver services in the way that are the cheapest for you, and you center your capabilities in markets that provide that advantage. So that's not a criticism, but rather just an acknowledgement. We have the luxury, in a sense, in this community of being a little more particular. So I mentioned the Gov Cloud. So notice that if you compare Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, they all operate domestic data centers, right? And if you are needing to do work that is highly confidential or classified, they have offerings that allow you to keep your data in a domestic data center. With that said, there's trade-offs, right? So if the premise is this global footprint gives you a level of flexibility, redundancy, then making a more circumscribed architecture for yourself, right? Using only domestic data centers may impair that somewhat. But I just want to say that in my experience, that is really a secondary concern. Don't think it's far less reliable or trustworthy simply because you have fewer data centers than all domestic. Will the slides be shared? Yes, the slides, my understanding is the slides will be shared. Everything I have in these slides is shareable. So let's talk about cloud as a transformative factor in IT. I mean, without exaggeration, I can tell you that cloud is probably the most transformative something I've seen in this industry. So going from a within our own four walls mentality in the late 90s when I entered the profession to now contemplating which combination of global data centers are we relying on and a third party hosting all of our data and our applications is really a transformative experience for us. So if we look at total revenue, so this is starting in 2019 and going to 2025, I thought this Gartner analysis was interesting because it shows a couple of things. One is that we're going to continue to see that traditional growth, that growth in cloud migrations and cloud utilization, and that we reach a point, if Gartner is correct, in 2025, where we see the cloud investment surpassing traditional IT investment. And you can see the revenue growth and plotted the same. So what does this tell you? Well, a couple of things. One is the cloud's here to stay. The cloud will be the center of gravity, right? So as we think about architectures, technology, security, we are rapidly moving to, and some would argue we're already in, a cloud-centric world. If we did a show of virtual hands, I imagine that lots of folks have heard the expression, right, cloud first, that our strategies as organizations, we will go to the cloud because it is the most advantageous financially and operationally for us. I think that may not even be a question in 5 years. I think that it will be assumed you're cloud first in most organizations. Now, again, I know in the audience today, and my organization also has these concerns. We have a level of assurance required in our handling of data that may alter that somewhat. But generally, looking at this looking at it writ large in IT, this is where we are and where we're headed. There's a question. Does it matter technically whether the data center is domestic or not? Well, by technically, there's a couple of ways to answer that. So from a technical perspective, geography does introduce considerations of things like latency and reliability, right? So think about the number of hops that the transaction takes, right? So if you're located in Northern Virginia and the data center's in Northern Virginia, right, there's fewer hops. If you're located in Northern Virginia, but the data center's in India, there's more waypoints on that journey, right? So I think it does matter. If the data centers have the same resilience, if they have the same capabilities, I guess in one sense it doesn't, right? But I think that it comes down to differentiating that based on the path the data takes and the potential for latency, that meaning delay, for something going wrong, the transaction being lost. So I'd say yes, in a sense, focused on network connectivity. For a tactical use of the cloud by the military, does the distance that information has to travel ever impact the ability to send and receive information and any practice? So I think I've touched on this, but yes, my answer would be yes, it does, right? So in our work here at CERT, at the SCI, right, we've worked with DoD partners. We talk about not only bandwidth constrained situations, but also the difficulty in having lots of hops in great geographic dispersion. So I think the answer is yes. Again, they're not insurmountable. I would describe it as fit for purpose. So how fast does it need to be? And how does that stack up against other requirements like cost, the resilience of it, the things that the cloud may bring you, the ease of provisioning, all those attributes that we really like about the cloud need to be weighed against potential complications and negative factors like slowing down the flow of the information from A to B. So I hope that's answered the question, the question adequately. So one of the things that we need to understand, and I've described it as you're managing arm's length. The tools in our toolbox are very different in the cloud than they are when things are all within our own four walls. We are going, in almost all cases, especially for the big three, we are not likely to have a right to audit clause. So how do we have appropriate assurance that cloud service provider is doing things not only in accordance with the contract and our SLAs, but in a way that is sound, foundationally sound from a security and controls perspective? Well, we have to then rely on third-party assessments. So one of the transitions I see in the executive education students that I teach is that, being, in this case, let me describe the experience of a CISO. CISOs traditionally have been technologists, but increasingly CISOs need also to understand contracts and how something like a SOC report, right, is used to give you justifiable, verifiable confidence in a third party. So in a sense, the cloud means we're all in the third party risk management business, whether we have the skills or we don't have the skills. And if you don't have those skills, you have to build those skills. Just a small kind of a side call out here. One of the things that I see as a bit troubling is that organizations that move to the cloud will often eliminate the staff most important to understanding these things. So part of that efficiency or part of that arbitrage is reducing your own staff. Be careful not to eliminate the people and the roles that are most capable of managing the performance of the third. So we've discussed service level agreements, right? I'm sure folks are familiar with that. I've mentioned something called a SOC report, right? So a SOC report, again, is a third party statement of evaluation of a control environment. They come in a few flavors. For this audience, forget about the SOC 1. The SOC 1 is used for financial accounting, financial audit. You'll most likely be presented a SOC 2 or a SOC 3 report. A SOC 2 report is usually a full information. A SOC 3 is a redacted version of that, right? Essentially for those evaluating a cloud provider that don't have an existing NDA or contract. I could drone on about this all day, but I'll also I'll give you this potential insight, which is SOCs, right? They come in types. So type 2 and type 3 are what's germane for us. And then you'll have a SOC 2, so that's the category, and then a type 1 or type 2. A type 1 of those reports looks at control design exclusively. So are the controls designed in a way that should work? A type 2 evaluates the performance of the control. So when in doubt, look for a SOC 2 type 2 or a SOC 3 type 2. And I would say that if you see a SOC 2 type 1, ask if that's really sufficient for your needs. I also reference here a related set of standards. So something called an SSAE 18. I should also offer this opinion, right, which is it's really good that these standards aren't coming out of IT or IT security. These are coming out of the financial services and accounting industries. And why I say that's a plus is they aren't mired in sort of the traditional qualms and squabbles we have in IT, but rather focus on outcome. So these report types and this way of thinking is common to the CFO and the CISO. And I think there's a power. But that specific standard, the SSA 18, requires a service provider, a cloud service provider in our case, to enumerate all of the subordinate organizations they depend on. So if we did a virtual show of hands, I imagine folks have heard of something called the fourth party problem. Think of it as the third party risk management iceberg, where you know the prime, but you don't know all the subordinate organizations. That standard and that report makes the organization at least list and determine the quality of the service that they're providing. So there's a question. Do we know how cloud environments flow to individual contractors through compliance standards like CMMC? So the best answer I can offer there currently is that you should view the cloud environment as an extension of the organization. So if you have a specific compliance obligation, assume that is then projected on and transferred to the cloud provider that you're depending on. So I don't want to kind of trade or traffic in fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but I think, right, as a cybersecurity practitioner, it's important to note that bad stuff does happen in the cloud, right? There are outages in the cloud tied to the same things that cause outages when you run this infrastructure, such as failed change control, insecure APIs, and environmental issues, right? There was an incident a few years ago where Ireland was having a particularly hot summer. The ambient temperatures were exceeding what the Google data center could contend with, and the service went down for a few hours. Right? If you were depending on that cloud data center, you had an interruption. Now, Google rapidly fixed that and then transferred the load to somewhere else. But if you're getting into the cloud, worrying about how hot summer is in Ireland probably isn't something you've thought about, right? You think those concerns have gone away. And likewise, cybersecurity concerns don't go away just because they're in the cloud. Yes, the provider may be doing a better job than you. Yes, their bench and their tool set may be more robust than your own. I wanted to draw our attention to CloudHopper. CloudHopper was a series of attacks. I kind of simplified it for this presentation. APT-10, which we know is a Chinese entity, Chinese government entity, part of the People's Liberation Army. They were successful in navigating the gray space between the things that the cloud service provider were operating and the things that clients were operating. So that confusion, or maybe that ambiguity over who's doing what, allowed this adversary to insert themselves. So the way I describe this, imagine a hallway, and you've got rows of doors on both sides and a set of shared keys. Well, this adversary basically created malware that allowed them to test all the doors and find the open doors. And both parties thought the other one was watching the door. So I know this isn't a cybersecurity presentation, and I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, did a really good analysis of this incident. It's called CloudHopper. It's worth a look if you're concerned about security in the cloud. Undoubtedly, more of this will happen, right? The difference between resilience and security is that we have the ability to detect, respond, and recover from these sorts of things. Can we actually purchase the hoodie? I believe you can. So there's a reference here to the hoodie at right. There's kind of an adage, right, that there is no cloud, just your stuff or your information on someone else's computer. And that maybe is kind of a glib, reductive way to look at it, or a cynical way to look at it, but it's also true. And I put it on here because it's a good reminder that this isn't a panacea, that the concerns we had pre-cloud and the concerns we have in the cloud are largely the same, just in a different form. Can blockchain technology interact with cloud technology in meaningful ways with respect to cybersecurity? Yeah, I think so. So if we look at the blockchain as an immutable record, because at the end of the day, that's what it is, right? Let's say, for instance, you want a very detailed record of everything that happens in a transaction set. Let's say it's supply chain risk management. You could certainly host in the cloud a mechanism to make sure that you have that immutable record for each of those transactions in a way that gives you some justified confidence. So I think the answer is yes. If you're interested in that in particular, IBM has some interesting research and suggestions as to the interplay between the cloud and the blockchain. So I wasn't sure if including this was appropriate for this presentation, but I think it is. So indulge me if this kind of wasn't what you were expecting. So we're talking about the cloud. It's a 101, basic introduction to the cloud. This story, is just a few weeks old. So software called Basecamp, they announced recently they're leaving the cloud. So imagine this is the end of the trail here, the opposite of vendor lock-in. Why I thought this was interesting was they decided that it was simply just too expensive for them. That the pay by the drink way of working made it too unpredictable, which was a challenge for their business model. And if you read this, what you'll find is that they think they can do it as good or better than the cloud service providers. So I don't know if this is the start of a trend or kind of a singular example, but certainly I think it's kind of worth considering. And because of the kind of prominence of this software and the cloud service providers involved, I thought it was important to include this, that yes, there are some, or at least there's one notable name that decided to leave the cloud, which is not something I would have predicted a few years ago. How is edge computing different than cloud computing? Okay, so architecturally, imagine now that you're going to push your compute resources or your compute transactions and your storage out to a number of nodes that aren't centralized, but rather following those spokes on the hub, right? So we could do another presentation just on edge computing I think the interplay between edge computing and cloud computing is really interesting, where perhaps you're maintaining edge computing. You're going to do the compute with an array of devices on the ends of those spokes, but you're going to use the cloud service provider to store the data. So I think, Paul, that's a great question, and a kind of emerging line of reasoning and research, which is there some mix here where we can get kind of the best out of operating client server technology without just kind of wholesale saying, no, it's someone else's to worry about. So keep that equipment, but then depend on some central portion of the cloud for things that are easier to, and maybe more reliable, done centrally. So I was hoping to leave about 45 minutes, or sorry, no, I'm sorry. I was hoping to leave about 15 minutes for comments. I'm sort of on track, so I'm happy to take any other questions you may have. I know that was a very quick discussion of the cloud. I'm hoping that I piqued your interest. Maybe you've learned something new in all this. There's many very informative resources out there. If you need an additional sort of cloud primer, I'd be happy to pass those on to NDIA to pass on to students as well. So what is Kubernetes? Okay, it's another way of doing containerized compute. So James, I think that's another lecture unto itself, another discussion unto itself. But if you're interested, have a look, because I think it is another interesting technology. Do the Chinese and Russians have cloud capabilities? Well, okay, a couple ways to answer that. All of us have cloud capabilities, right? In the sense that we are all eligible to be part of this cloud infrastructure. I mentioned two Chinese cloud providers that are commercial. So Tencent Cloud and Alibaba Cloud. Those are wholly Chinese. The Russians, I don't know of any. I'm sure they're there. I'm not aware of the names of the specific Russian cloud providers. There certainly aren't any prominent or commercially important Russian cloud providers. What is the best alternative to the cloud? Is it a private cloud? You know, Neil, the question becomes, what are your needs, right? So if those attributes are really important to you, so the ability to scale quickly, self-provisioning, ubiquitous access, then yeah, I'd say it's a private cloud. But you may find that you don't need those things, and perhaps staying in the traditional way of working is adequate. Do current weapon systems make use of cloud capabilities? Well, you know, I think that's a bit of a tricky question. Weapon systems in the larger ecosystem sense certainly do draw on things in the cloud, but I don't think it's correct to say that there are weapon systems controlled from the cloud just yet. I just wanted to say thank you for delivering this in such a succinct way, and it's easy to start. Oh, thank you. That's a very nice comment. Thank you very much. Can you speak the difference between commercial cloud hosted versus government cloud, i.e. GCC, High, Microsoft, or Cisco? Many on the call are likely government contracting. Yeah, so Paula, think of it as the same underlying technologies, right? So everything we've said about the cloud applies, but it's a question of the security you apply, so the barriers, and then the physical location of that equipment, right? So again, you know, reference, right, our discussion about domestic data centers, and ensuring not only that data is in a place that we understand where the data is, but it can't interact with other data sets, other clients that may not meet the same standard security and trustworthiness as the gov cloud or the high security cloud. What challenges did you run into with the JEDI program? Why did it go wrong? Okay, good question. I mean, this is my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone except for me. But I think, you know, when I boil that down, a $10 billion sole source contract for cloud computing is really ambitious. So what went wrong? Well, maybe the scale and the ambitious nature of the proposition. Are there any undiscussed questions for policymakers on cloud pending potential legislation areas in need of rulemaking? Yeah, there are several, right? So think, like most technology situations, legislation hasn't caught up yet to the tech. So think about questions about data ownership and privacy. If you pass a law and there's pending privacy legislation that in the US that would require a cloud provider to enumerate where the data is at any one time and then ensure it can be completely and demonstrably erased, that's a challenge, right, for cloud providers. So kind of variations on a theme. So anytime you see legislation that requires IT to do something, assume in the cloud it's more difficult or more complicated, I should say, because of the dispersed nature of the cloud. Specific cloud legislation. There is rulemaking legislation, as I'm sure lots of folks are aware, requiring federal agencies to use the cloud and to find efficiency in the use of the cloud in the federal space. But that's, I think, slightly different than what you're asking. Are there any legal issues with where information is stored in the cloud in terms of law enforcement activities? There can be, right? So again, I'm not an attorney by background or education, but my understanding is there have been concerns about jurisdiction where data resides and the ability to extract that data. Are you aware of any references per a cloud versus on-prem cost analysis? Similarly, you're aware of a needs assessment analysis process for determining whether a performer should move to the cloud. Excellent. Oh, thank you. So Kenneth, yeah, the Cloud Security Alliance, I think is a good place to start for that. Gartner, Deloitte, EY, they all have versions of that sort of calculator as well. And then, of course, the cloud service providers themselves have those sorts of tools for you too. But again, maybe take with a grain of salt because they're selling you cloud services. Again, I don't think it's disingenuous, but right, I would use those with eyes wide open. What are the unique workforce education or training requirements for companies to take advantage of the cloud, or is it the same as traditional computing? No, I think it's slightly different, right? So as I mentioned, the way in which you will manage your relationship with the cloud vendor is different than the way you worked internally. So ensuring that you have the ability to understand contracts, create SLAs that are meaningful, create metrics that are meaningful, independently verify those, drive for substantive changes in behavior if corrective actions needed. All those things are slightly different. So I'd say that for those responsible for managing IT, it's quite different. For the end user, not really, right? It's probably not that different. Okay, so I thank you for your kind attention for the presentation. I believe we're going to transition here for closing remarks. My email is in the presentation. Please do reach out to me if you have questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you. Mark, back to you.
Hey, yeah, I'm back. Matt, first of all, that was absolutely fascinating. Exactly what we hope to see in a one-on-one presentation. I think you got it at exactly the right level. Obviously, lots of interest. Loved all the questions from the audience. So again, thank you for doing this, and thanks to the entire audience for your participation in this. Again, we are planning to post the recording online probably in the next few days. It'll be on NDIA Connect. The slides will be available as well. Also, as always, if you, the audience, have feedback about this series, including topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future, please email us at eti@ndia.org. If I may, I'd like to take the opportunity to highlight just a few upcoming events sponsored by the Emerging Technologies Institute. We are working with the Science and Engineering Technology Division on their Executive Breakfast Series session with Dr. Ben Petro. That'll occur on November 10th. It will be held at the NDIA offices. Dr. Petro is the Director for Defense Research Operations in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And he's going to be talking about the DoD Defense Laboratory Enterprise and how NDIA members can partner with the labs. So I'd urge you all to consider attending. Should be fascinating. And especially shout out to research labs and our academic partners. We're also hosting a workshop with Matt's own organization, with SEI. It's going to be on the topic of Undersecretary Heidi Hsu's new modernization priority, software. So She's added software as one of the DoD top modernization priorities. And we're going to be holding this workshop in person here once again at NDIA headquarters at Courthouse in Arlington, Virginia. That'll be on Monday, November 14th, and it will include speakers from academia, industry, and from the Pentagon, including the Research and Engineering Office. So please check that out as well. Registration information is available on our website, or feel free to reach out again to eti@ndia.org. And with that, let me once again thank all of you. Matt, phenomenal job. Audience, thank you so much for your attendance. And everyone, have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.